All right, well, this is in Mark chapter 10, and I'm in verse 42. But Jesus called them to himself and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you. But whoever desires to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever of you desires to be first shall be a slave to all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." Father, these are words that are so hard for us to fully understand and appreciate. But we do thank you that you sent your Son to be a ransom for us. And we ask that you would help us to better understand these things and what it means to serve others. And we pray all these things in Jesus' holy name. Amen. All right, well, we're finishing up, I hope, chapter 21 today. And although we only have a few verses left, there's an awful lot here to talk about. Just keep that in mind. And then, the other thing, of course, is just, where we started in Genesis was this idea that Genesis is going to tell us so much about everything. It is the beginnings, and it's the themes and the stories and the meanings are better, evolved and explained later as we go through the Bible. But it all starts here, including seeing God's nature and man's fallen nature and man's need for God and these type of things. Now, in chapter 21 at the beginning, we read about the birth of Isaac. And, Abraham was pretty excited about that. And then after that, he sent Hagar and Ishmael away. And we saw that, Abraham didn't really want to do that. It wasn't what he wanted. But God made it clear to him that it wasn't just, Sarah requesting that he do this, but it was God's plan too. And God, in part, did it and reiterated that Isaac would be the one that would inherit the covenant and the blessings that would ultimately lead to Messiah. In verse 15, we read that God didn't address Hagar until her water was completely used up. And we can ask the question, well, why not earlier? Why didn't God come to her as soon as she left the camp? She had to be a little bit scared and nervous. And it's pretty clear that she wasn't ready to listen. She didn't know that she needed God. She had to get to the end of her rope to really figure that out. And that's when she called on God, is when she ran out of her own options. Okay? And this is really similar to the birth of Isaac. God waited until Abraham and Sarah knew that God, was the only possible answer. Nothing else had worked out. Trying to take matters into their own hands and being, Abraham 100 years old and Sarah 90, that this just wasn't going to work again. Okay? And, God used the wandering of Hagar and Ishmael in the wilderness as an opportunity to see God's mercy and provision and love. Although it appears that neither one actually really turned to it. But that's the way God still works today. He often waits until we're at the end of all of our options. We think we've done everything we can before we're ready to turn to God. And then he gives us this as an opportunity to see him. Okay?
Oh, we talked about that last week. To pray first and then work on stuff. And I realized this week just how much I don't do that.
Mm-hmm. I think it's very natural. And we also talked a little bit about how Hagar and Ishmael also represent a large part of the population. Those who experience some aspect of God's love and provision. And we all do. Everybody does at some level. But they don't really ever accept it. His ultimate gift of salvation, which is so sad. So we've seen obedient Abraham, faithful Abraham. We've seen God being faithful to his promises, that he showed up when they needed him, but only when they did need him, that it took them a ways to get to the point where they needed him. And then Hagar and Ishmael don't appear to ever accept God and his gift. So we pick up now in verse 22 of chapter 21, and we find an interesting interaction between Abraham and Abimelech. Now, when did Abraham meet Abimelech last?
I'm trying to remember. Was that when he there was like Abraham defeated everybody?
No, it was just a couple of chapters ago, if you remember. Abimelech is the name of the ruler. It's as much a title as anything of the Philistines.
Oh! He gave his wife to him.
That's right. He didn't leave Israel this time, but he did go to the southern parts of Israel, and he gave his wife Sarah to Abimelech to spare his own life, to make sure that Abimelech didn't kill him to take Sarah. And this was right after God had promised that within a year Sarah would have a kid. And so we start this part by seeing a second interaction between Abimelech and Abraham. Okay, so we've seen, like I say, God's faithfulness to Abraham. Okay, and Abraham is done pretty good in chapter 21, but God shows us this faithfulness in chapter 21 by bringing Isaac just as he has said, by then reiterating his promise that Isaac would be the fulfillment of the descendancy and the heredity that would lead to Jesus and all those kind of things, despite Abraham's sin with giving Sarah to Abimelech just in the previous chapter. Okay. Now, while this chapter builds off of chapter 20, where Abraham had really kind of departed from God's way, wasn't faithful, didn't trust, Abraham, as I say, has been faithful all along through so far in chapter 21. And it's going to end with Abraham recognizing God's eternal faithfulness and then choosing to celebrate it. And what we're reading about in chapter 21, in my contention, is the stories of a man who has now learned and is now demonstrating to completely submit to God. Okay? And we're going to see that proven again in the next chapter, but in this portion of it, we're going to read of Abraham's submission and faithfulness for the third time in this chapter. Okay, so Abimelech is going to come to Abraham, and let's read verses 22 and 23. Oh, why don't you do 22 through 24, Maya? Okay.
Okay. At that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, said to Abraham, "God is with you in everything you do. Now swear to me here before God that you will not deal falsely with me or my children or my descendants. Show to me in the country where you are living as an alien the same kindness I have shown to you." Abraham said, "I swear."
Okay, now let's talk a little bit about this. So verse 22, the story kind of starts with Abimelech coming to Abraham, and notice how it says, "Now it came about at that time." So what time is this?
Right after Isaac is born.
Okay, shortly after Isaac is born, probably more like 3 years after.
Okay.
What else?
I don't know, because...
Well, after Hagar and Ishmael have been sent away.
Hagar and Ishmael go away.
Okay. And you can look at it that way. But my belief is this chapter is about Abraham's growth. And we're seeing the process of sanctification in all of these previous chapters about Abraham. We're seeing his growth. And he's done good things, and then he's failed. And then he's been faithful, and then he's failed. And he's been faithful, and then he's failed. And in this chapter, we're going to see the third instance of him being faithful. Okay? And so really, when we read this about, at that time, okay, what God is really saying is, after he's worked all these things in Abraham's heart to grow Abraham closer to him, to grow Abraham more faithful and more obedient. So yes, immediately after Ishmael and Hagar leave, and I say immediately, but sometimes shortly thereafter, but after all of the things that we've been reading about for the last few weeks, okay, all of these events that were so important in forming Abraham's new nature, okay, developing him, growing him, sanctifying him, okay. Now, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, come to Abraham. Why does he bring the commander of his army? Why does anybody bring the commander of their army to something?
To show that he has power, or
yeah,
he's not afraid to use it.
Yeah.
But obviously, I think he's afraid of Abraham because God is with you, and he knows he's not going to win.
All of those things. I think that's exactly right. I don't think it's an accident that he brings the commander of his army, and I don't think it's an accident we're told about it. It tells us where Abimelech is mentally, okay? Now, this statement, God is with you in all you do, is really interesting. Now, I mean, it's a very interesting statement. And one thing, the first thing that should probably come to mind is the realization that non-believers, even non-believers, can recognize the difference between those people who walk with God and those who don't. Okay? I mean, it's just clear. Even if you're not perfect. Now, they may make fun of you because you're not perfect, but they recognize that there's something different. Okay? Now, why would Abimelech say, hey, that God is with you in all you do?
Because he's extremely wealthy. He's extremely powerful. He had a baby when he was 100 years old.
And his wife had a baby when she was 90, her first one after being barren. And by the way, we're going to see that actually is the bigger miracle. It's not Abraham fathering children, okay? It's really more Sarah having kids at 90. And if you remember,
I agree.
Yeah, you remember a couple of times ago we read how it said, elsewhere in the New Testament that Sarah was given strength to do that, right? So he brings his commander of his army. Why? Well, he answers the question right there, because God is with you. So it's really kind of a weird statement in a sense. I mean, he's bringing the commander of his army, yet one of the reasons he says, I know God is with you, is because I am sure he's heard about how Abraham defeated the 4 kings from the east just by himself. After they had ridden, through that whole area, Canaan and the Promised Land and all of that portion of the Middle East. And remember, they took captives and they cleaned up, and they because all these guys wouldn't pay tribute, and so he's going to bring the commander of his army to protect him essentially against God. Isn't that interesting? And yet that's what people do all the time. Oh yeah, I'll do this to protect me from God, right? He's trying to display his power and his force. Why else? Now you got to dig a little deeper here and think about this. But I think it's because Abimelech is worried that Abraham is going to steal his land. Okay, like I say, Abraham has just demonstrated that he has the power in the army, even if it's small, that with God's backing, he can beat the guys who beat everybody else in this area. Okay? Now, up until now, Abraham hasn't had a son. But what has Abraham always wanted? That son, that heir. And Maya, as you just said, he's literally the most powerful guy and the richest guy in the area, although he's not doing anything about it. He's not lording it over everybody. He's living as a sojourner. But Abimelech, now that Abraham has a kid, I think is worried. Oh, what if he wants to take it now for himself? Okay? He gets concerned that Abraham will want the land and the remainder of the riches, and then he'll take it from his own family and the Philistines, now that Abraham has an heir. Not only that, what if Abimelech's heard the story, maybe through some of Abraham's servants, because they have to go and barter and get food and do this and do that, and maybe they've heard the story that coming out of Abraham's camp, Abraham's convinced that his God has promised him the land. Okay? So you can see that there's a lot going on here. Okay? And in some respects, when Abimelech shows up, he says, God is with you in all you do, it almost sounds like he's kind of maybe flattering Abraham, right? Okay? So he sees God power. He sees God power in multiple ways, and all of these kinds of things. And not only that, of course, that God came to Abimelech in a dream, right? So he's scared. Verse 23. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my offspring or with my posterity, but according to the kindness which I have shown you. You shall show to me, notice this, and to the land in which you have sojourned. So I think Abimelech is a little nervous here. Okay?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So if Abimelech can say God is with you in everything you do, and he realizes there is a God, he doesn't believe in our God?
Hang in there. We're going to deal with that. Okay. We've got to wait to the end of it till we see it. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So why does he say, promise me you will not deal falsely with me or my offspring?
Because he's worried.
What? But specifically, why?
Because he's going to take over.
Specifically, why does he say you will not deal falsely with me?
Because he already dealt.
Because he already dealt falsely with me.
Yeah, he already lied to her once.
Yeah, he lied about Sarah once. Okay, you know what that's called? Justification. And I mean in a legal sense, not a biblical sense. Okay, I mean he's got a good reason for worrying about the honesty level of Abraham, doesn't he?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean I can't blame him for that. And then of course don't forget, just a couple of chapters ago, what did God do? Completely obliterated Sodom and Gomorrah. Holy smokes! What if this guy's God? What if they're closer than even I realize? So he says to him, "Swear to me here." Now, swear, it's probably translated in your Bible. It really means oath, but in this context, of course, it means like give me an oath, swear to me. It's the word shavah, okay, and it means an oath or to swear. Now, this word we're going to come back to. I just pointed out that it's here. It's really very important to this story, okay? And as I said, don't deal falsely with me. Abimelech has really good reasons for telling Abraham, hey, don't do that, okay? I mean, combined, all the things we've talked about, Abimelech has a lot of reasons to worry, all right? His history with Abraham is not that great. He knows something about his God, Okay, now Abraham's got an heir, something that he might want the land for. So you can see what he's going on here. What he's really saying is, look, somehow I conquered all this land. I want it for my posterity. I want it for my kids. You're just a sojourner. Don't take it. Okay. Notice he says also, according to the kindness that I have shown you. And we can ask, well, what kind of kindness? Now, if you go back and you read in chapter 20, what you find is when you do that, is you remember Abimelech was actually pretty generous to Abraham when he returned Sarah to Abraham. He gave them oxen and sheep. He gave them a bunch of silver. Basically, said, "Get out of here," right? So he's hinting, "Hey, look, I've been kind to you. I've been generous to you. Be generous to me." Okay.
Well, isn't it too, since Abraham is like a wanderer, and he's letting him just stay there on his land?
Yeah, that's part of it. That's part of it. And that's part of why I say I think he's pretty nervous. And I actually suspect he probably has somehow heard hints and rumors that this God of Abraham's has given him the land. Okay. And it maybe if that's true, then it would be interesting that after Abraham defeats those four kings, and now some of these other things, that he hasn't taken it. Okay, if you think about it. Okay.
I had a question. When Abraham says, "I will swear," doesn't he need to consult God before he starts making oaths like that, or is this something different, or?
Well, I don't think so.
Okay.
But it is, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I do think that it is important to notice a couple of things here.
Like when Joshua swore an oath without
Yeah.
consulting, and then it backfired on him.
No, I know exactly what you're getting at.
Okay.
But I think what he's really doing is, swear to me that you will not deal falsely with me or with my offspring or my posterity.
Okay.
Okay, Abraham is really saying, hey, I promise I won't deal falsely with you.
Okay, I'll tell you the truth.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean anything else. Okay.
Okay, and I think there's at least somewhat of a commitment to, hey, and I will deal kindly with you. Okay, and so I think that that's part of what's going on here. Now I think also we need to notice a couple of things here. The first is, Abraham just readily admits, hey, yeah, sure, I swear. What doesn't Abraham do? Well, he doesn't try to defend himself or his character.
But he doesn't.
He doesn't come out and say, well, Abimelech, hey man, you've got a reputation for stealing men's wives, just killing the guy and taking his wife. That's why I did it. He doesn't say that. Okay, he doesn't say I was scared because of who you are. He doesn't. So he doesn't defend himself. He basically admits, yeah, you're right. I dealt falsely with you and inappropriately with you. Notice the other thing he doesn't do. When Abimelech hints about and the land, he doesn't stand up and say, well, wait a minute, boy, pal. You and Philco, you get off your little horse there, you commander of your army. God gave me this land, and he'll smite you if I call him to. He doesn't say any of that. He just says, okay.
He's just being humble and he's trusting God that he knows it's really his.
Isn't he?
Yeah.
See, Abraham is actually going to choose to deal very wisely with Abimelech. And this is the start of it. He doesn't do what's natural. He doesn't defend himself. He doesn't try to explain to him it's really his land. He's saying, when it's time, God will give it to me. Okay? And he's doing it in a very appropriate way. Now, I may be a little wrong here. Okay? I could be. But I also think, and we'll see it in a minute, I think there's almost a hint here that when Abimelech says, hey, and deal kindly with me as I have dealt with you, okay, is in terms of the kindness that I've shown you, I think there's a little bit of a hint. I think Abimelech is tipping his hand a tad. I think not only is he saying, look, don't take the land, but you know, when we read in chapter 20 how Abimelech was so generous and gave all this oxen and the sheep and all these pieces of silver to Abraham, I think he's hinting at, I want my sheep back. I want my oxen back. Mm-hmm. Okay? Because I don't think he gave him a little bit. Okay? And remember, what he did was he gave it to him to basically demonstrate, I've wronged you, I took your wife, blah, 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 blah. Even though it was Abraham who really was in the wrong. It was a type of Mid-Eastern apology that, hey, you know, I've insulted your integrity. Here, let me give you all of this stuff to make it right. Okay, so that's just me. Don't know that I can prove it, but I'm just throwing it out there. Okay. Anyhow, I think you can look at verses 22 and 23 and say one more thing, which is in you've already hinted at this already, is that Abimelech and the Philistines are noticing Abraham's God. Okay, they've noticed that God is with him, and they're asking him to swear by that God that he won't deal falsely. So I think there's an essence that they recognize that Abraham's God is important to Abraham. In other words, Abraham is demonstrating that. And they've also started to notice his God. Okay?
You know what it reminds me of, though, sort of, and it's hard to explain? You know, when the big suck up, okay, when everyone disappears, people are going to notice God, but they still aren't going to believe.
Yeah, no, I get it. Okay.
I just find that incredulous. I really do. Like, how did they see this and then not fall to their knees and be like, holy smoke, I had it all wrong?
Well, my answer to that question is simply, you've seen them convince themselves of really stupid and absolutely ridiculous logic and explanations for a long time now.
Well, yeah, like right? A man can become a woman and vice versa.
So, you know,
if you can get people to believe that.
You get them to believe that kind of crap. You can get them to believe evolution. You'll get them to believe anything.
Yeah, I guess you're true. I guess that's true.
Yeah. So, anyhow, so, so let's go on to verse 25. Marie, will you read 25 through 28, please?
Okay. Then Abraham rebuked Abimelech because of a well of water which Abimelech's servants had seized. And Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, nor had I heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant. And Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves.
Okay, good. All right, so it's interesting. After Abraham immediately agrees not to deal falsely with Abimelech, what does he do?
Rebukes him for
stealing his wells. Yeah. You know, I mean, what's he really saying here?
Okay, well, don't you
deal falsely? You know, yeah. I mean,
I'm confused, and it's like a well on Abimelech's land that Abimelech thinks is his, but Abraham knows it's really his.
But Abraham's sojourning there, and Abraham dug those wells.
Oh, okay. All right. So I guess back then that was a thing that you were allowed to do, even though if it wasn't your land.
I guess. Okay.
Okay.
Now some translations will say in verse 25, but Abraham complained. But the word here really has more to do with this idea of rebuke. Okay. It's yacha. It means to reprove, rebuke, or correct. Okay. And so it's a lot more harsh than simply he complains. Okay? And notice he does it because of the well water, which the servants of Abimelech had seized. Now, let me ask you a question. He's saying, look, you want to play nicey, but your servants just stole these wells from me. They've taken them, they've plugged them up, or they're out, around them, or whatever it is. And Abimelech's answer to Abraham is what?
I didn't even know.
I don't even know. You never even told me about it, right? Now, let me ask you a question. What do you think the likelihood is the king doesn't know that this has happened?
Oh, you better know.
0.
Yeah, exactly. He's already said why he knows. Because Abraham is powerful and his God is with him. Okay, why do you think he brings Philco, the commander of his army, with him?
Just in case trouble.
Just in case there's trouble around these wells, and Abraham's willingness to acknowledge that the land is actually Abimelech. And notice that Abraham never really says that. He never says, yeah, the land is yours. He just passes that over. See, that's the difference between him and the false commitment to the Canaanites like Joshua did. Okay, if Abraham here doesn't bite. He just says, yeah, I won't deal falsely with you. He doesn't say, yeah, it's your land and I won't take it. He like I said, he's going to deal really wisely with him. He just lets it go. But he does say, but you took those wells that I dug. Okay.
Yeah, this like reminds me of a mafia.
What do you mean?
Well, like an argument or agreement or something like that, and two powerful players, just.
So I'm going to come back to that in a second. I
Okay.
think this is a chess match.
Okay.
Okay. So let's get to that in just a second.
Okay.
Now Abraham complains. Abimelech says, because the well water which your servants of Abimelech have seized. Now the word in Hebrew, gazal, is to take violently, to seize as plunder, to rob. Abraham's not messing around here.
Yeah, and Abimelech knows.
And Abimelech knows. Okay, Abimelech has got to know. Why, if his servants go and take wells from this really powerful guy, Abimelech is going to kill him.
Yeah.
This is an act of war in the desert.
Mm-hmm.
You're taking a man's water supply from him. There's no way Abimelech does not know this. Okay, most likely this is a blatant lie. Okay, can you imagine what Abimelech is going to say to the servants after this? If he doesn't really know about this, those servants are dead, like I say. Okay, now God has given the land and the wells to Abraham and his descendants. But I'm going to keep harping on this. Abraham is going to simply trust God. Okay?
Instead of taking matters in his own hands.
That's right. God had told Abraham he would be a sojourner in the land, but the descendants would return to it. And we see all this in chapter 12 of Genesis, verse 7, chapter 15, verse 16. And then God told Abraham he was to walk the land in chapter 13, verses 17. And this is so important to see, because when Abraham was getting ready and getting impatient and wanted an heir, after listening to the promises of God for X number of years, he's willing to accept Sarah's suggestion of, well, we'll go sleep with Hagar and call that your heir. He was willing to take things into his own hands then. He's not now. Okay? And by the way, look at it from the other side of the coin. If Abraham was going to take the land, well, now's the time to do it. Okay? Now is exactly the time to do it. And yet, Abraham, the whole point of this, or one of them, is that Abraham has learned. Okay? Verse 27, Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant. See, I think Abraham discerns some of Abimelech's intent right here and now. Abimelech, to make a big show of what a generous and forgiving and wonderful man he is in front of his own people, gives this sheikh Abraham a huge amount of sheep and oxen to say, look, I didn't mean to impugn your integrity. But oh, by the way, I give it to you just as an act so you know that I'm this great guy. I want the sheep and oxen back. I think he took the wells. I think he sent his servants to take the wells just so he could come here and confront Abraham about the land and about not dealing falsely with him, about being nervous about his God. And I think Abraham has figured this all out. Okay, why does Abraham accuse him of this? So Abraham can give him the sheep and the oxen back. Just in the same way Abimelech took his wife and then gave him stuff for impugning his integrity. Okay, Abraham's going to do the same thing. Okay, Abraham's going to say, "Oh, okay, you say you didn't take them. My mistake. Here, take all these sheep and oxen, but get your servants away from my well." See, Abimelech's going to take the gift, and all of a sudden the wells are going to be back in Abraham's control. Okay, it's actually identical to what we read about in chapter 20. And so Abraham giving him the sheep and the oxen back, okay, just as Abimelech had given him in verse 14, chapter 20. If I had to guess, Abraham gave him the exact same sheep or the same amount of sheep and oxen back. You know, I mean, they're playing games here, in my opinion, okay? And it's kind of this, okay, look, you're on my land. I'm not going to kick you off. You're a great and powerful man. Your God is with you. But the land is really mine, and I want my sheep and oxen back. Okay? And you can imagine that you know, because Abraham's a mighty, powerful man, that Abimelech did give him quite a number of sheep and oxen. Probably cost him a lot. Maybe even some standing in front of his people. But now if he's going to come back with those sheep and oxen, guess what's going to happen to his standing in the eyes of his people? Holy Moses, you got those sheep and oxen back from the sheikh Abraham. Wow, what a great guy you are. See, Abraham has figured this all out, in my opinion. Okay? Let's see. Now, ultimately, Abraham's approach here, this way of dealing with Abimelech, trusting in God and agreeing not to give Abimelech the land because it's his. So he just, like I say, he doesn't argue with him about it. He just skips over it. But then to treat him this way, it's actually going to cement a relationship and create peace in this part of Canaan. Okay? It's going to stop a war from happening. Okay? In a sense, Abraham has the opportunity now to teach Abimelech about integrity after having been lectured about morals and integrity by Abimelech in chapter 20, verse 9 and 10. Okay? God has given his prophet an opportunity to change his ways and to demonstrate that he's a new man. Okay? So he sets these 7 ewe lambs and flocks off by himself. Okay? And in verses 27 through 30, we see Abraham's full approach. Abraham takes the sheep and the oxen and giving them to Abimelech, and the two of them make a covenant. Abraham then sets after the covenant, sets 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. Verse 29, and Abimelech says to Abraham, what do these 7 ewe lambs mean, which you have set by themselves? And Abraham said, in verse 30, he said, you shall take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, so that it may be a witness to me that I dug this well. Okay? Abraham's approach to Abimelech is to be generous. He's not demanding his rights. Like I say, he's trusting in God to make all things good. And if you think about it, it sounds a little bit like Jesus. Okay? Jesus doesn't demand his right as God while being down here. Okay? He doesn't do any of those things. He simply trusts in God and does things God's way. See, God's people are forgiving, are peaceable, and they trust in God's ultimate judgment. Great. Now, there's another way to look at this as well. And this is really important. It's to look at it from God's perspective. See, God is using his servant Abraham to make himself better known to the Philistines. The Philistines already know him as a powerful God that can wipe out Sodom and Gomorrah, who's against unrighteousness, who can take care of the four kings and everything else. But notice, now he's seeing that Abraham's God also wants him to deal with him in this way. And it's really important to see this. See, first reason is God wants to use his servants to represent himself to others, but can only use us after we've submitted to God's ways. This is why it's so important to see how earlier in the chapter Abraham is submitting to God's ways. Even when he doesn't want to send Ishmael away, he does it. Okay? Once he's learned to submit, God can use him to represent him to others. And this is what Jesus told his disciples. Go forth and take the gospel and make disciples of everybody out there. Show them who I am. Now, there's another reason this is really important to see. 400 plus years from now, Joshua is going to return to this land, and he's going to bring the entire nation of Israel with him, okay, and their army. And he's going to fight a whole bunch of wars to reclaim the area. And one of the things that non-believers always say is, what a bloodthirsty God. He had no right to do this. He just kills these people and everything else. Yet God claimed earlier when he talking to Abraham that he was going to give the Canaanites 400 years to show their true nature. Now here's the evidence, or at least some of it, that God was working during those 400 years and even before that to make himself known to all the people who lived in Canaan and to give them a chance to turn and repent. Okay? All right? He's working through Abraham, and he's going to work through Isaac, and he's going to work to a lesser extent through Jacob and the 12 sons. But actually what's going to happen is the nature of the indigenous people who are ungodly in their ways is going to start to permeate Jacob's 12 sons. And so God is going to create a famine to get them out of there, to keep them from that influence. But during the 400 years they're in Egypt, he's going to continue to work on the Canaanites. And here's the evidence, the proof of it. He's starting with Abraham. Okay? So God does give them this chance, and it's really important to see that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Verse 28, Abraham set 7 ewe lambs. 7. Now, the word in Hebrew for 7 is savah. Okay?
Remember when we were talking about other things too, 7 is always a special number?
It is. We're going to come to it. Okay? So, Seba means 7, but in its origin, okay, it's related to the word Sabah, oath. Sabah, oath, is actually the origin of the name of the word 7, okay? So they're very closely related, okay? So when he says 7 ewe lambs, Yes, it means the number 7. It's really literally 7 additional lambs there. Okay, but it also comes from and has a really strong connotation of the word oath. Okay, now verse 31. Okay, well, I'll just keep going. So he says, "You take the 7 ewe lambs from my hand, so it may be a witness that I dug this well." In other words, when Abimelech accepts these 7 ewe lambs, what's he doing?
He's accepting the fact
That they're Abraham's. Done deal.
Yeah.
This is included now in the covenant. So Abraham's giving him back his oxen and his sheep, saying, I've insulted you, everything else. However, I'm going to give you an extra 7 ewe lambs, essentially for you to prove, so you to buy into this idea that they are mine. It's interesting. Abraham's actually buying the wells that belong to him. Again, Abraham doesn't worry about this. He has God on his side. He knows it even better than Abimelech. Okay? So it's saying, let it be a witness. So verse 31, therefore he called that place Beersheba, because there the two of them took an oath. Now Beersheba is an interesting name. It means, and there's different interpretations, but they're all very closely related. Some will interpret it to mean the well of the oath, because of the strong relationship between oath and the word 7. It's also interpreted sometimes to mean well of the 7, but probably the best and more accurate meaning of it is the well of the 7-fold oath. Okay? And this is a big deal, the well of the 7-fold oath. Okay? Sorry, I got to check a couple of notes here. They called this place Beersheba. They make, verse 32, so they made a covenant at Beersheba, and Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, arose and returned to the land of the Philistines. You know, if you think about it, when it says they returned to the land of the Philistines, this is really a sad statement. Okay? If you think about it, they're so close to Abraham's God. They're so close to God, yet they return to the land of the Philistines. Yet, many people have pointed out that in Genesis chapter 26, we're going to see Abimelech yet again, and Phicol, okay, in 26 verse 28. Abimelech and Phicol are going to visit Isaac. And when they do, they're going to use the covenant name of Yahweh for God. Isn't it interesting that maybe it just takes time? Now, the Philistines as a whole are not going to come to God. But maybe this man Abimelech and his commander Phicol do. Okay? And so we see that beginning of the works of God through his servant Abraham. Okay? And again, it's interesting that Abimelech brought his general with him just in case. Yet Abraham readily agrees to a peaceful covenant and gives gifts to Abimelech. Again, he's representing God in a way that Abimelech never really expected. Verse 33, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree at Beersheba, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. Now, this is one of the many names God uses for himself in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, God says, don't make any idols of me, because you'll never capture my entire nature. But what he does instead is he uses a whole bunch of different names to begin to reveal his nature. Now, he doesn't do that in the New Testament. Why?
Because there's Jesus.
That's right, because Jesus thoroughly reveals the nature of God. Okay? So El Olam is this idea of everlasting, perpetual, eternal. It's interesting that it's based on the word conceal. He's so everlasting, he's so all-encompassing that he's actually concealed. Okay? And as I say, it describes one aspect of God's nature, his infinite character. Now, what I love about it is in the Hebrew, and for the Jewish people, this name El Olam, everlasting God, came to be represented by this idea of from the vanishing point in the past to the vanishing point in the future. In other words, when you try to understand God and his origin in the past, you get to this point where everything disappears and you can't understand it. It's like, I don't get it. I can't imagine it. And you can do the same thing about, well, what about the future? What about forever into the future? It's like, the concepts vanish. I really, really enjoy this idea of he's the God from before the vanishing point in the past to beyond the vanishing point in the future. Now, tamarisk tree, Ethel, means a tree, or also often means a grove of trees. Now, it's not really clear whether Abraham here plants a single tree or a grove of trees. In some places, it seems to imply a grove. Who knows? Most people believe that this tamarisk tree is either the same as the salt cedar in the southwest U.S., or it's very similar. It's related to it. Okay? And the salt cedar is well known for its survivability in harsh, dry climates. And it's fairly long-lived. Okay? It's very common in the land of Israel. As I said, a very long-lived tree. A tree or a grove of trees that can give shade and rest, particularly to a traveler, a sojourner. Now notice the contrast here. Abimelech and Phicol return to the Philistines. Abraham returns to his relationship with God. This idea of he's planting this tree, this grove of trees, is this idea that, hey, my descendants are coming back here someday. And when this tree and this grove of trees are great and big, I'm going to have built shade for them. I'm going to build a place for them to rest. Okay? What we see here is that all through this encounter with Abimelech, with Abraham turning back to his tree and calling on the name of God, Abraham has really been focused on God all through the interaction with Abimelech. Abraham's priority is actually his relationship with God. This whole well thing, and you can imagine how important wells are in the desert, it's just a minor problem to Abraham. He's trusting to God, to the everlasting God. And he demonstrates it by not demanding the justice, not demanding his rights, but instead by giving things away and then planting a grove of long-lived trees to honor the everlasting God, okay, and in waiting for his descendants to come and camp under it. It's a beautiful picture when you think about it, okay? Now you remember the word oath, savah, and 7, savah, are closely related. In fact, like I said, they're the same base word. And you can ask yourself, why would 7 and oath have that kind of connection? Why would there be connection? Well, for one, it's a great connection for the name Beersheba, but it references back to something even more important. Anyone want to guess? 7th day of creation. It was an oath of God. Remember we said, when you read through creation, the first day, the second day, the third day, the fourth day, We read about the beginning of day one, the end of day one, the beginning of day two, the end of day two. We never read that about the seventh day. There's no end listed for the seventh day. It was intended and to communicate an everlasting day of rest and relationship in the Lord. That's the connection. It's a reference back to the seventh day of creation, a day of everlasting rest in God. See, Abraham is going beyond this idea that my descendants will someday park themselves here under this shade. He's saying someday there's going to be a day of everlasting rest and relationship and fellowship with God. That's what Abraham is looking forward to. Okay? All right, and this is why it's so important to observe this day of rest, 1 day in 7. Not that you just sit on your butt and do nothing, but that you spend the day in relationship with God and in serving Him and growing and closer to Him. Okay? By the way, if you really want to see little signs of God, you want to guess how many times between verse 23 and the end of this chapter Abraham's name is mentioned? 7. You want to guess how many times Abimelech's name is mentioned?
Was it twice?
7.
Oh, they were both.
Because they have an oath, an everlasting oath. I wonder if Abimelech will be in heaven. Obviously, this whole idea of returns to the Philistines, I think implies that the leader and the Philistines don't change. But I don't know that this particular man didn't change. So why, now as we try to understand God and His Bible, why would we return to the story of Abimelech? Remember, we started in Genesis chapter 1 and 2 saying, look, God can't possibly tell us every last aspect of creation and how He did it. We'd never understand it, okay? So He picks and chooses what stories He tends to share with us. In in chapter 21, we've seen the evidence that Abraham has become a different guy. He faithfully circumcised Isaac. He faithfully celebrated the weaning of Isaac, his beginning of his growth into manhood. Not that he becomes a man, but the beginning of the growth into it. He faithfully sends Ishmael away, even though he didn't really want to. Why this story? Well, it's to show how Abraham has grown. And now his focus is on the eternal God. See, we see that. And in order to get there, Abraham had to see the faithfulness of God. Even though he knew he hadn't been faithful in the past, he saw that God was faithful to him nonetheless. It's really important for us to see the faithfulness of God to us in our lives so that we can grow and want to be faithful to God. Abraham chooses peace. He demonstrates humility. He decides to buy back the land and to buy back his own wells. He doesn't demand his rights. Instead, he represents God to Abimelech and trusting in God. And the question that this chapter presents, this ending of the chapter, is, do we make those same choices? Do we choose to represent God and to be faithful to His ways instead of demanding our rights? Another reason we see this story here is to show how God uses the faithful to represent Him to those who don't know Him, to make God known. Abraham is clearly beginning to make God known in this land, okay? And God is being known through His servants. See, if we're not acting like God, if we're not representing God, how are people going to get to know God? Okay, sure, God's Spirit works in them? Absolutely. But as I said a little earlier, that was part of the Great Commission. Go out and represent me. Make my word known. Let people know me through you. Okay? I think lastly, we see this story right now to give Abraham this opportunity to make amends for his past behavior. Isn't it marvelous that God tells us, hey, I've forgiven every bit of your sins. They're just gone. And not only that, I'll give you opportunities to prove it, that you're a different person, that you are a new creature, that you have a new nature. God does this all through our lives if you think about it. And you know what? If I miss the first opportunity, he's going to give me another. And if I miss that one, he's going to give me. That's how great God is. And if we look at Abraham's life, these past chapters that we've been reading about, we can see that actually every time Abraham failed, it was an opportunity to prove that he really was a new man, that he really believed God. And God just kept providing him, even when he failed. It's all there. The big picture of this chapter is Isaac is born, Abraham demonstrates faithfulness, okay, and his obedience. And it's cemented in this interaction with Abimelech, okay. Now the last thing I think is just finally this idea that Abraham has truly, I think, gotten it. I think chapter 1 tells us Abraham has really gotten it. He finally figured it out. Up till now, Abraham does great, then he fails. He does great, then he fails. He does great, then he fails. We're not going to see Abraham fail again. And I think that this chapter starts to set that process. And in fact, the next chapter, if you don't believe it from what I'm telling you now, the next chapter, the offering of Isaac, absolutely proves it. We're starting to see why a man that wasn't all that completely faithful at first ends up being known as the father of the faith. Okay? Any comments or questions or thoughts?
I just wanted to share something, and I don't, not that it's because of, I mean, part of it is because of what we're saying now, like to learn and to be aware, that Abraham is finally getting it, but yeah. It seems like something very small, but to me it was very profound. When I was sitting down at dinner, I don't know what night it was this week, and I was telling God, thank you, and I talked about my dinner and say something. And I said, thank you again for providing me nourishment, for feeding me. And then it dawned on me, I had never, ever known hunger. Sure, you can be hungry and then you go get yourself a snack and you make yourself dinner. Mm-hmm. But it dawned on me right then and there, and it hit me hard. No. God, and I don't understand why, because I am not worthy, but I have never known hunger. He has given me food my entire life. And I'm talking physical food, not food for the soul, okay? He's done both. But it blew me away. I don't know what it means to be hungry. And it was, I don't know, it's making me cry. I don't know why I've never thought of that before, but I've never been hungry.
God gives his people what they need, not necessarily what they want. Certainly there are believers in the world who are hungry, but God is taking care of them in ways that are really important. Okay?
No, I know. I know, but for whatever reason, he has kept me.
That's right, for whatever reason. And that there is reasons. We don't know what they are. Okay, anything else? All right, let's close in prayer. Who wants to pray?
Okay. I can.
Okay.
Dear God, again, as always, thank you for your word. Thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you for Eric for helping me to understand everything that's in the Bible. I just don't know where I would begin because I'm not that great of a scholar. to really truly understand. But thank you for your love, for your kindness, for your protection, for the food that you give us all. Just thank you for everything. Amen.
Amen. And help us to be faithful servants.
Yeah. Hey, Eric, did Marie show you pictures of the tree on Facebook that went down in our yard?